Hi, folks, and welcome to the Book Club of the Lotus Eaters, episode 15. This time, we're going to be talking about Robert Conquest's Reflections on a Ravaged Century. This was a really, really nice thing to read if you're not like a deep historian and you're not into reading like the long, boring series of like, here's an event, here's an event, here's an event. This is Robert Conquest's sort of personal analysis of how bad the 20th century was and why it went so wrong. And as you can see by the logos on the front, it's because of communism and Nazism. He thinks it was bad. So I did read this, but I read this about 6 months ago. And honestly, I can't really remember that much about it, probably because on a sort of like point-by-point basis, it's all stuff I already knew and agreed with. And because Robert Conquest is not afraid to editorialize in his analysis of what's happening, especially in this. So how did you find it, Callum?
Pretty good. I mean, the way I ended up choosing this is we both read it before expecting to do this, and then we left it on the bookshelf, and then I found it again. I was like, oh, why haven't we done this? Well,
Yeah.
no, we should.
Yeah.
So I didn't like the writing. I just didn't feel like he flowed from topic to topic as well as he could have, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the worst, but it was just something that irritated me. Mm-hmm. But the thing I hated, and was the worst, is that he'd sometimes just use like a French phrase or a Russian phrase, and he'd write it out in French, and then just move on, not explaining it.
Yeah, but this isn't uncommon either.
I know, it's just so bloody annoying, and I hate it.
Edmund Burke does the same thing. I was reading his reflections on the French Revolution, and or something in Latin. It's like, right, okay, don't know what that was. Moving on, But this is just something like
whatever.
Historians do sometimes.
Could be much worse. So the book was published in 2001, apparently. So that's gonna color some of the stories we go through and tell. So with this, it's similar in my mind to Mal's Great Famine that I did a book club with Blow on, and the best way to do that was just pick some random stories and do it. Because, as you say, it's not a long-winded chronological history.
It's not a comprehensive history.
No, it's him running through some ideas and story to story to prove his point, and that's fine. That's a great way of doing things. One thing I will mention as well on the preamble is he's very hardline. Like, very much, I think you put it, if a socialist eats tonight, we failed.
Yes.
Yeah, like, even on the issue of detente, so the idea that we have too many nukes on both sides is bleeding us to death on both sides. Maybe
they have too many nukes on their side.
Yeah, it's just like, no.
This is why he's so great.
They'll get an advantage out of this, therefore we should just not do it at all.
He's such a hardline anti-collectivist, I guess you say. He's just pro-Western.
Yeah.
And, the kind of more, we need more historians like that in my opinion.
think significantly identifies that Nazism is a collectivist socialist theory that you have to get from socialism, from the Marxist variety.
Yeah,
National
you can't get to it through conservatism.
Yeah, race socialism and Marxist socialism are just the same thing, but you replace the proletariat and the bourgeoisie with different groups, practically. Anyway, let's get into the book. So, part one, he splits it into two parts. So, first part is called Mind Slaughter, an overview of social experiments and their political inventions and failures. So we go with chapter one, and I'm going to go through just whatever I found interesting in each chapter.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's because it's one way of doing it. So he says in chapter one, the ideologies of the 20th century were inspired by the scientific success in understanding the natural world. If this was so successful, why not solve societal problems by addressing society through the same scientific process? Mm-hmm. And of course, this is going to produce immoral fanatics.
Yes.
But we only know that now, let's say. Should have been obvious at the time, but now we have the concrete proof.
I mean, this was something the entire 20th century was ravaged by, the idea that we could scientifically organize human society. And look what happened.
So he gives an example of Bertrand Russell. Yep. So he gives a quote from him in which he says, if it could be shown that humanity would live happily ever after the Jews were exterminated, then there can be no good reason not to proceed.
Yes.
These people are crazy.
Yes.
I mean, they can prove it with all the science they want, but if they have no moral foundations, then, well, they will lead themselves to that.
Yeah, I mean, the first half of the 20th century was essentially an attempt, philosophically, to establish, like, science as being something that can be done to humans. And the whole thing, we've been over this before, like devaluation of language, to establish a kind of morally non-judgmental language. And it's like, okay, but that could be used to justify any horrific thing.
Yeah, this is why Science Man on
Yes.
the TV is always a bit sus.
Yeah.
Okay, so he gives another example in which he does an interview with Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm on the Late Night Show in 1994. Quotes here. Asked to justify his long membership of the Communist Party, he replied, "You didn't have an option. You see, either there was going to be a future or there wasn't going to be a future, and this was the only thing that offered an acceptable future. The interviewer, Ignaf, asked, in 1934, millions of people were dying in the Soviet experiment. If you had known that, would it have made any difference to you at the time? Hobsbawm responded, this is the sort of academic question to which an answer is simply not possible.
Just say no.
I don't actually know that it has any bearing on the history that I have written. If I were to give you a retrospective answer, which is not the answer of a historian, I would have probably said probably not, as in it wouldn't have made a difference to him. The interviewer, Ignaf, says, why? Pertinent question.
Yeah.
Hobsbawm responds, because in a period in which, as you might say, mass murder and mass suffering were absolutely universal, the chance of a new world being born in great suffering would still have been worth backing.
Delusional.
It's nuts. I mean, the idea it's universally taking place as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In Britain, America, Canada, Australia, there wasn't universal suffering because there wasn't the attempt to create a scientifically engineered society.
He decides to continue instead of just stopping. Now, the point is, looking back at it as an historian, I would say the sacrifices made by the Russian people were probably only marginally worthwhile. So it was still worth it, but only marginally.
Oh, so he's on the Diane Abbott position. Is it more good than harm?
The sacrifices were enormous. They were excessive by almost any standard and excessively great. But I'm looking back at it now, and I'm saying that because it turns out the Soviet Union was not the beginning of the world revolution. Had it been, I'm not sure.
Well, there we go.
The interviewer responds, had the Radiant Tomorrow actually been created, the loss of 15 to 20 million people might have been justified. Hobsbawm says, yes. Finally gets him down.
And now you can see why Robert Conquest has got absolutely no time for any kind of moral appreciation of Nazism or communism.
Yes, but also the point he's trying to make there in that section was that the Western liberals, such as Neville Chamberlain, as a good example, have no imagination of what a totalitarian, totalist worldview looks like. And you can take that from, of course, Hitler or Stalin's Russia, but both of them the same. And he also makes a point that the childlike absolutist solutions of these regimes are thought by Western liberals as just like, oh, come on, they're not stupid enough to do that. And
they are.
They're going to do it. So that's why he's trying to make the point. They will literally do anything because they're making a new future. So chapter 2, A Culture of Sanity. So he goes back to England. He lists political advancements in England that are formed by habits and can be somewhat mythically traced to the woods of Saxony, which is a cute term.
I love his little Anglo-Saxons in the woods. You know, it's first of all, it's when they first in Germany to England to then to the Americas.
He even makes the point of like the Saxons had kings, the Angles and the Jutes didn't. So he has some speculation about whether or not the royal family technically comes from that tradition, and the fact that Saxon kings weren't absolutist. It's just speculation on his part. So the acceptance of criticism of the government, freedom of printing, whatever you wished, until the Parliament came along. Best example given is civil society as a concept, the idea that we have political life and public life, as in you can do what you want in your
personal life.
So you can go bowling with a guy of the opposition party, and you're just members, and who cares?
You're still neighbours.
Yeah.
Scruton has a great line on this, is the idea that it's the first person plural we, as in we who occupy this space, is the most important thing to, I guess we'll say, the English, whereas on the continent, come the French Revolution, it all became politicized along lines of beliefs. And I mean, this was still the problem. This is a problem that happened during the sort of the religious wars in the 17th century.
He even makes the direct comparison that you're making, which is that the French revolutionary philosophers denounced civil society as a concept as counter-revolutionary. So
I mean, it is. It's openly counter-revolutionary.
How dare we be friends?
I don't want to shoot my neighbour because I like to have a barbecue with him. Well, that's very counter-revolutionary. Well, I mean, I guess it is. But anyway.
Yeah. So we move on to chapter 3 after him talking good of England. And he says, Marxism has become a new doctrine. In the world of theory, it's obviously insanely wrong. In practice, it's obviously murderous and naturally attractive to midwits.
I mean, he doesn't use the phrase midwit, does he?
No, that's me writing my
Yeah.
notes, but just a summation of his
But
arguments.
that's what he's saying, yeah.
Yeah, and also naturally repulsive to plebs and the highly intelligent, as in the kind of... Yeah, that's just what he
Yes,
argues.
I love the meme. The meme is true.
Literally the curve meme.
Yeah.
He got it in 2001. So naturally, the lackluster university classes of the West are the only ones who buy into Marxism because they're the midwits. And also, naturally, as a result, Marxists hate the working class and the plebs, or the uneducated, as they like to speak.
They hate the aristocrats for being oppressors, they hate the plebs for being counter-revolutionary, uneducated losers, and they're desperately aspirational.
Why aren't you backing me in my ploy to gain power?
Why won't you come and kill people with me?
Yeah,
Don't like murder. Murder's wrong, simple as.
counter-revolutionary.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's what I found interesting there. We'll move on to chapter 4. So he talks about nationalism and its influence, specifically Germany, because Germany's probably the worst example.
That's what comes to mind when you hear the word nationalism.
Yeah, and he points out that unlike England, Scotland, or Switzerland, European nations have had the idea of nationalism put top down.
Yes.
So the state existed in England before the state of England,
Oh, yeah.
but the opposite is not true of Frenchmen. And he says the French peasants did not see themselves as Frenchmen, united and indivisible, before they were forced to. So you were owing to whatever group that was not Greater France. I mean, you even have like linguistic differences in these times.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was like literally 18th century. Most of France didn't speak French. You know, whereas in England had been a united nation since like the 10th century. So, yeah, he's absolutely right. Well, this has had a huge impact on the way that both nations view the world, I think.
So he then moves to next door, Germany, and how weird they are. So
Yep.
Germany's national history is also strange. The Second Reich, quote, was an extraordinary chimera with a strange parliament and a militaristic emperor who had real power, which doesn't make any kinds of sense, but whatever, it's what they did. So he also describes Germany as, quote, it is only fairly recently that a Western country like Germany can be said to have qualified as a mature nation-state, so it may be thought that we can hardly expect early evolutions in less civilized areas. Talking of their political actions. It's like, well, it's sort of the argument for the Islamic world, where they're a younger religion, therefore they should be allowed to kill people. And it's like, well, the Germans are a younger political civilization, therefore they should be allowed to be barbaric.
Maybe it's not necessarily be allowed, or maybe it's just be expected.
Just an observation, yeah.
Yeah.
So then
just on a quick point, I don't think Islam gets away with that now. It's 1,400 years old. Come on.
Still has his defendants for that argument.
Wow.
So he then goes through fascism and how it can only be arrived at through being a socialist, socialist doctrine, basically replacing class with nation, and then the National Socialists, the Nazis, replacing it with race, fundamentally. So he then moves on, and he mentions how there are similarities between the fascists and the communists, particularly in Germany, on the idea that they see the Peasant Rebellions of the Middle Ages as the early sproutings of their ideas.
Do you know anything about these?
No, I don't.
Right. Okay. So this happened at the sort of time of Martin Luther, and then you had like the levelers and things like that in England as well. But in the, I think it was the 16th century, after, was it 15 something or other, when Martin Luther put his 95 Theses on the door. A few years after that, there was a massive peasant uprising in Germany where they were like, yeah, good point, Martin. We're going to tear down all of the nobles and all of the property can go. And Martin Luther was forced to come out and be like, I'm not for this, because there was, massacres in the countryside and all this. And eventually, like 100,000 peasants were killed by the aristocrats. They got their armies together and just crushed them. But it was brutal. And it presaged all of the sort of wars of religions and communist uprisings and French Revolution and all that, and it's just like, right, okay, so this is an idea that's been in the sort of in the ether somewhere for a long time.
But did it have stuff to do with socialist theory or not?
Well, I mean, it's proto-socialism, right? It's looking at going, well, why can't we all just have the same thing? And it's like, well, because then we all have nothing, unfortunately. But I mean, don't get me wrong, the charge of the aristocrats only have it through the rule of force. That's legitimate. That's fair. They didn't earn it through the hard sweat of their brow. They earned it by killing people, and therefore, why can't we just kill them and take it from them? Well, I mean,
because they'll kill you.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're way better armed than you was the answer. But,
He makes the point that both the fascist movements in Germany and the socialist ones the socialist, the Marxists, and
But I repeat myself.
and the fascists both looked at the peasant rebellions as like, oh, these are our buddies, these are our guys from back in the day.
I mean, maybe.
Is interesting. Also, they see the future basically the same way, that they're going to make some new man.
Yes.
So this new human being that is perfect, and all people are going to be like that. And also their moral nihilism towards violence.
Well, I love the new man concept, because notice how, like, one way that you can look at Marxism in particular is by the tyranny of the industrial labourers over the rest of the country. And when I was, what was I reading? It wasn't Mao's Great Famine, it was something else. But it was very obvious that if you just take it in and of itself, instead of being like, it's not a widespread class that's spread over the country. It's actually a very narrow band of people who are very centralized in Moscow or, St. Petersburg or wherever, the industrial centers. And then they tyrannize the countryside, being like, right, okay, peasants against the wall for being counter-revolutionaries and stuff. These peasants just like, what the hell is wrong with you? And so you can see it's very, like, it's the cities and a particular segment of the cities terrorizing the rest of the countries. So I just find that really interesting.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.